Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me. And this wonderful day, a momentous occasion, I am actually joined by somebody I'm very excited to have. He is a world-renowned economist, a world-renowned forecaster, and a man of so much renown. He actually has a film called The Forecaster, which is out there and is going through, I think right now, going through a few different film festivals. But it is the one and only Martin Armstrong from Armstrong Economics. Martin, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I want to give people a little bit of background. You're the founder of AE Global Solutions, Inc., Armstrong Economics, obviously, but also a lot of people may or may not know this because I became introduced to you through actually one of my listeners who is a huge reader of your blog, as am I, and came across this fascinating forecasting system, and an early adopter of AI is basically what you were in creating Socrates. And I'd love for you to tell people just a little bit about that before we jump into some of our topics like tariffs and the gold standard and the state of the world economy.
Well, my father was a lawyer. I started studying law, but I really just didn't want to go in that direction. So he pushed me into computers back in the 1960s. So back then I went to RCA. Most people don't realize, but it was the biggest in the computer world. They had all the government contracts coming out of World War II, etc. So kind of like Microsoft, they set up their own university there. Because you couldn't go to a university to study because they couldn't afford a computer back then.
Right.
They were like the size
let alone
of
have
a
the
room.
square footage, right? I mean,
right, pretty much, yeah. And then RCA decided it was going to sell off its computer division, and it sold it off to IBM, which was just a typewriter company back then. And Univac bought some of the balance. So I enjoyed trading, and so I just said, no. I mean, all the married guys were getting, because they were keeping all the government installations, and the married guys were getting London, Hawaii, Paris. I wasn't married. I was a young kid, so I was offered, back then it was top secret, Thule, Greenland, Guam, or Vietnam. And I did ask a guy, who did 2 tours in Greenland, what did you do? They just needed you in case NORAD broke down. Because I was at the design level, all right, and that's what he was. So they just needed somebody there at that level just in case there was an emergency, because they couldn't get planes in and out. And I asked him what he did, and he says, well, I watched the same movie 50 times, and I played, darts and cards, and that was about it, So I just didn't want to do that. And so I went back, I went into trading. And then I said, gee, I had learned programming and all this. I could do a computer to do all this. So I started developing, really Socrates, which I called it mainly because he was, sentenced to death because he knew too much. So I named it after him. And, I became one of the first international hedge fund managers. And what had actually developed, I had a client who was he was an executive VP at Franklin National Bank, and that was the first bank that failed after Bretton Woods collapsed. It was on a 10% move in the Italian lira, and of course they didn't teach foreign exchange or any of this stuff in school. It was all fixed exchange rate, Bretton Woods, gold standard stuff. And so he knew I was into trading. He says, would you come take a look at this? I think we got a problem. And it was a 10% move, and the bank went down on that. So it was the first bank failure due to foreign exchange in 1973. So after that, pretty much every currency crisis, you name it. They said, "Oh, go get the guy that did that one," So even by 1985, I was called in when they were forming the G5. They were going to lower the value of the dollar by 40% to help trade and all this stuff. And I had already, by then, I was one of the first international hedge fund managers. And I wrote a letter to Reagan. I said, you do this, you're going to cause a crash, within a couple of years. And nobody understood really what I was talking about. And then the 87 crash came. And what was bad about that was that there was no fundamental news. You picked up the phone, you asked the broker, why is the market down? And nobody knew.
Mm-hmm.
And so it started with all kinds of crazy rumors. President was killed with a bullet dipped in cyanide and all sorts of weird stuff, And actually, a friend of mine was an analyst, I think, at Payne Weber at the time, Jack Schwager, and they were blaming computer trading. We all had computers, and suddenly that's what caused it. And Jack called me and says, "If you don't do this, they're going to come take all our computers away." So I went in and to this Brady Commission. And at least, you can look at the report. I finally got them to realize it was foreign exchange. Mm-hmm. But they're not going to come out and blame the government. So they came out at the end of the report and said, nobody really did anything. We think foreign exchange had something to do with it. That was it.
Mm-hmm.
That was the best I could get out of it. But they didn't put any trading restrictions and all this crazy stuff because it was G5 that caused it. And because they had stood up in September 85 and said that they wanted the dollar down 40%. And what's important about that event is that the dollar then, was already declining. And then in February of 87, they had the Louvre Accord. They all got together again in Paris. And then they stood up and they said, okay, the dollar, that's far enough. And the dollar kept making new lows. Mm. When that happened, because the central bank said enough is enough, and it still made lows, there was really a panic in the international markets that the central banks could not control it. Once that happened, that turned into the panic for 87. And, they had sold a third of the national debt to the Japanese at the time. And so now that everybody's expecting the dollar, and the rumors in the international market was the dollar is going to fall another 40%. So they just start dumping everything. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to understand the implications of the global economy, because we really are all connected. Mm-hmm. And, this is coming into light now. And with Socrates, I could see how capital moved because we did foreign exchange. We ended up as the biggest advisors in the world, largely because they didn't teach any of this stuff in school or things of that nature. And I was going to open an office in 85 in Geneva. And I knew there was a lot of anti-Americanism over there at the time. So I went to lunch with one of our clients, who's one of the top 3 banks there in Switzerland. And I had a list of names like European advisors or whatever. And I asked him, I said, which one do you think we should use? And he laughed and he said, name one European analyst. And I was embarrassed because I couldn't. And I said, I'm sure there is. I just don't know. And he laughed and he says, there are none. He says, you don't understand why everybody uses you. And I said, no. And then he explained it. He said, because the currencies were starting after World War II from zero, basically, the politicians used it as a an excuse to say, see, the Deutschmark's up 20% against the dollar. That proves I did a good job. Mm-hmm. So obviously, no bank analyst is going to come out and say the Deutschmark's going to go down. It was a political statement in Europe, where it was not in America. No president could say, vote for me, the dollar's up against the Mexican peso 20% or something. He would have been laughed off the stage, So that's how we ended up being the biggest in the world, because even to this day, really, you'll never find an analyst in Europe saying that, the euro is going to crash, because the ECB will pick up the phone and say, fire that guy.
Yeah.
And even in 2007, there was an economist who stood up in Estonia and said that, we're going into a recession. They put him in jail for 6 months. So, I mean, this has been it. I think we got dragged in around the world, mainly because of foreign exchange. Because governments, that is the most important thing to them. And then, so when I designed Socrates, I understood the capital flows. For example, we were all there in 85 dealing with the OPEC money. That's where it was all being managed out of Geneva. And then the capital started moving to Japan. And so then you have the Japanese bubble burst in 1989. Then it's like, okay, what's next? Oh, Southeast Asia. They all ran down there. And it moves like a herd of wild animals. And everybody, they jump on the same trade. So like when Russia fell in 98 and you had long-term capital management, they were all in the same trade, and that's why you get these major crises, and because they try and sell and there's no bid, because they're all there. So,
well, you've also, sorry to interrupt you. You've been fantastic on, calling out the central banks and how, yes, these people move in herds, that there are cycles to business that exist. And really, no matter what you try to do to avoid them, they are going to defect, they will occur. And there's not much you can do to change these things, and obviously pushing back against the Keynesians, or the Keynesians. But you've also been interesting to follow, because not only are you talking about economics and the way in which the money is moving around the world with economic forecasts, but with Socrates, you've been accurate in predictions, not only on economics, but in movements and world governments. I think Socrates had predicted that even the World Economic Forum would be just really recently would be defunct. And here we go. We're looking at as you've got it, a possible coup. We're looking at Klaus Schwab stepping away. We're looking at the implosion of that in their 2030 project. So I'd be curious to hear a little bit about that as well.
Well, also back in the 80s, we had, because we were being called in for foreign exchange, we had one of the biggest banks in Lebanon. They said, look, we found a ledger in the basement. Somebody had written the Lebanese pound down for back to the mid-19th century. Could you make a model? I said, sure. Okay. So we threw that in. And what Socrates does, it's basically looking for that capital flows. Like that herd, where's it going to move next? It moves internationally, but also moves domestically. So like sometimes, real estate's the hot area. Okay, forget that. Let's go to AI. You see investment moves around like that. So when I put it in, and I didn't really know much about Lebanon, geopolitics, or anything. I put it in. I thought there was something wrong with the data. I called him and I said, look, this thing says your country's going to fall apart in 8 days. Something's got to be wrong here. And he very calmly said, well, what currency would you recommend? I said, boy, that's a strange response. I said, it says Switzerland. Thank you very much. 8 days later, the Civil War began.
Wow.
So what I realized was that he
was love getting phone calls from you, Martin.
he knew that was happening. What he came to
Yeah.
us for was for the timing.
Yeah.
Otherwise, he would never have called to say, So, and then I had a client in Saudi Arabia who was the biggest shipper in the Gulf. And he calls, he said, what do you think gold's going to do tomorrow? Iraq's going to start attacking shipping in the Gulf tomorrow. As you tell me a war's going to start tomorrow? Yeah. What do you think gold's going to do? So over time, I realized two things. One is that somebody always knows when war is going to happen. Even with the Hamas attack, you can see the defense stocks started moving, 7 days in advance. Mm-hmm. And I guess what we got really super famous for was I did a conference in London in June of 98. And I said, okay, fine. The computer says Russia's going to collapse. I give it about 30 days. And we saw 100 billion going in, but like 150 billion coming out. And the computer picked it up correctly. And what I didn't realize was that the London Financial Times snuck in the back of the room. So the next thing I know, the next day they put it on the front page. Armstrong says Russia's going to collapse, and we're going to have nukes flying all over the place. I said, oh, shit, and that was the long-term capital management crisis and all that. And, that's when the CIA came in. We wanted me to go build a model for them. I said, look, I'm not going to do that. Took me 17 years to build it here. I'm not going to go down there and work. I said, we'll run any study you want. And they said, no, we have to own it. I said, forget, not for sale. I mean, from their perspective, it was like national security. They didn't want anybody else to have the same info, and, but basically that's what it's doing. It is monitoring absolutely everything in the world, all the individual stocks from every country, the exchanges, the real estate markets, interest rates, currency movements, and it puts it all together. I suppose an individual could do it, but it would take them maybe a month to do it for one day, and it comes out and it very clearly shows you where the hell we're going. And
it's interesting. Sorry to interrupt you, but because again, this is all based in, as you mentioned, different markets where money is moving, where interest rates to currency rates to, and that shows you, I think, more than anything, that all of these wars that do go on, as you mentioned, what are they being guided by? It's by greed, it's by self-interest, it's by these different personal interactions or governmental interactions and interests that are moving it. Because rarely are we seeing necessarily a reaction to a natural human movement, and instead, as your model's predicting, we're seeing a lot of the financials indicate the world events that are upcoming and ongoing.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's pretty clear. The U.S. was virtually bankrupt in 1896. It's when J.P. Morgan had to lend $100 million in gold to the Treasury to bail it out from the Silver Democrats. And it was World War I and then World War II. As Europe is blowing itself up, all the money came here. So after World War II, we ended up with 76% of the official world gold reserves. We produced all the food, all the arms, all that. Yeah. So, war is insignificant in the sense of if World War I and II didn't happen, we'd still be a bunch of farmers, right? And so this is, the Industrial Revolution, all these things were put into high gear because of the war. And I remember, my mother saying when she was young, the women had to work in factories because guys were going off, etc. So this is, part of the process. And, it's, you see this going on right now, like with Ukraine. The computer even picked Ukraine. I stood up at our 2011 conference in Philadelphia, and I said, look, computer says war is going to start in 2014. That was the Ukrainian revolution. And 2013, you can still Google it. It's, I said, okay, fine, the spot, it's Ukraine. People ask me, how does it do this? Crimea has been a prize in wars since the days of Nero, all right? For thousands of years, so many different things have been fought over Crimea. Even the Black Plague came from there. It was and to this day, about 15% of the population of Crimea are Tartars from the days of the Mongols invading back in 1240. And there was an Italian post there, and they had brought this plague from Asia. And so what they did to get rid of the Italians, they were taking and catapulting in the dead bodies into the fort. The Italians got scared, they fled, and they took the Black Plague back to back to Europe. So, and wiped out half the population of Europe too. So, Crimea has been a hot spot for thousands of years. You just look at this Zelensky gets his orders from the neocons and NATO. I think he just came out today. No, I reject it. In Germany just told him, reject the peace deal. You're not going to give up Crimea. There are no Ukrainians in Crimea.
Right.
All right. 15% are Mongols, and the rest of them are Russians. Mm-hmm. They speak Russian there. They don't, it's, what are you going to do? You're going to take it over, and then you're going to, there was what started the whole separation movement was after the 2014 revolution. The Ukrainians were killing Russians on the street in Odessa. They all ran into the trade building, and they set it on fire and burned them to death. And then, the Donbass wants to separate. Gee, why would they?
Yeah, who could blame them?
They always say, Putin unprovoked. Really? All you got to do is just Google it. It's Victoria Nuland is the one over there. They were handing out sandwiches during the Maidan. You had John McCain on stage. We will support you. Overthrow your government. I can't imagine. What if Putin stood on the steps of the Capitol Hill? Overthrow your government. We will support you.
Right.
The audacity of that is incredible.
Absolutely. And you've been outspoken on your blog, and I don't know, I'm guessing also Socrates probably is backing this up, but the fact that the neocons really want World War III to happen in Russia. They want that to be a conduit. And to a point you made earlier about essentially defaulting on debt and the value of currency, I do wonder if that's a large component in that. The worldwide debt, this kind of financial markets that are built on top of each other, and using World War III is essentially a default to that.
Well, they always default on debt with war. Even the U.S. did. You can look in the Constitution. We will honor the debts of the Continental Congress. They never did. You can buy continental currency on eBay, no problem. There isn't, I think the only two instances of a country ever paying off its debt was Andrew Jackson when he shut down the Bank of the United States for a brief period of time, and Romania. Other than that, everybody has defaulted, period. Why they call it AAA, why people even buy government debt is, I don't know, deranged, I suppose. But war is the excuse to do so. Just look in France. France, we're in the Fifth Republic. And when you create a new government, those last ones were bad, so we don't pay their debt. It's pretty standard. And when they were forming the euro, they actually came to me because we've been number one in foreign exchange globally. So I sat down with them in 98. Okay, this is how we create a currency. And I can tell you the real problem behind the euro, why it has never been able to basically compete with the dollar, is because Herbert Kohl was the Chancellor of Germany. And you can even Google it up. Before he died, he admitted that he acted like a dictator. He took Germany into the euro without a vote. And he said if he allowed the German people to vote, he would have lost 7-3.
Mm-hmm.
So his condition was that no consolidation of the debt. And I warned them, look, if you're going to try and create a currency to compete with the dollar, you have to have a national debt. And they said, well, look, we just got to get the euro in first so they can create their government. We'll worry about the debt later. Now it's 2025 and they still haven't. And, it's just, as a fund manager, let's say I got $10 billion. I can pick up the phone and say, buy me 10 billion of US treasuries. I can't with Europe. I still got to make the same decision. Gee, do I want Germany? Do I want France? Do I want Italy? Nothing changed. You eliminated the currency, but the volatility just moved to the bond market. So that's the problem.
This might be a perfect time to talk about then the gold standard, because I know you had actually talked. I wore my Ron Paul shirt today. My Ron Paul gold standard with Ron Paul holding two gold guns, because you've actually had some private conversations about the gold standard with Dr. Paul, who for a lot of our audience, for me, brought me into the movement. A lot of our economics and my economic understanding is based on reading and talking about Ron Paul. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the gold standard, and then I know your time is valuable. We can finish up with tariffs, because we've already been talking for about a half an hour, which is indicative of a good conversation and an interesting guest. But I know you do have other things to do.
you have to understand is that there is a business cycle, and no matter what you want to do, the gold standard was part of the Keynesian economics, fixing it, etc. Nothing can be fixed. All right, because why Bretton Woods collapsed? Because you can't have a gold standard without also, fixing everything else. And they printed money like endlessly to fund wars, etc. And yet gold is always $35 an ounce. I mean, I think a 3-year-old with a pocket calculator could figure out when it's going to go bust, right? And the problem, you can have, they go, oh, there's been a gold standard for thousands of years. Not true. Yes, gold was used as money, fine, but it wasn't fixed. It floated. All right. Just look at the gold silver ratio. It's been 120, been down to 16, and it's been all over the place. And that's the real problem. We can never create a fixed exchange rate, regardless what it is. If it's gold, chickens or whatever you want to use, because there is a business cycle. All right. And there could be, a drought and suddenly wheat doubles in price. All right. You can look before Bretton Woods and look at the California gold rush. Gold fell dramatically in purchasing power because so much more of it came out. So, I mean, this is just normal business cycle issue. So, the people are mixing up central banks, gold standard, and they don't understand what the real facts are. When the Fed was created, it was created absolutely brilliantly, and it would have worked perfect. All right. To the slogan that it was lender of last resort meant that when you were in a recession and banks weren't willing to lend, a company could issue short-term paper and the Fed would buy it. So they didn't have to lay off employees. Then what happened? World War I came. So the politicians directed the Fed to buy government debt, not private anymore. And they never put it back.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Then FDR comes in, and you can look in any like newspapers.com or whatever, and you'll see like, interest rates from 1927. Why do we have 13 branches? Because each branch was independent.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the panic in 1907, there was a San Francisco earthquake. And so the money moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. This capital flows we've been talking about. And banks would fail on the East Coast because there was a shortage. All right. So they created 13 branches. And if there was a shortage of cash in one region, they would raise their rates to 4%. Everybody else is at 3% to attract money there. So that's what I mean. It was a brilliant design originally. And why did the banks own it? Because it was supposed to be a bailout paid for not by taxpayers, but by the banks. All right. So the banks had to pay into it. All right. That's more or less what J.P. Morgan did in the panic of 1907. He got all the banks together to bail out the bad ones, not taxpayers. So that's what it was based on. So when FDR came to power, he then usurped the Federal Reserve, made it one interest rate, so he could basically do his New Deal out of Washington. He picks the chairman, et cetera, and all this stuff. So the Fed was actually ordered to do more or less quantitative easing for World War II. That if interest rates rose above this certain level, they were to buy all the government debt.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1951, the Federal Reserve broke with the Treasury and White House. And they don't really teach this in school, but you look it up in the newspapers, all right? And because they wanted them to do the same thing for the Korean War. And the Fed said, enough is enough. We're not going to do this. And so they broke. And so since then, you've had this more or less the Federal Reserve independence. But a lot of people blame the Fed. This. They're not the problem. The real problem.
It's still part of the problem. I'm still majorly in favor of ending the Fed, but go on.
No, it's worse than that. All right. The Federal Reserve basically can create the short-term cash. That's it. All right. It's such a small percentage of the economy. The real problem is before 1971, it was illegal to borrow against government debt. If you had an E-bond, you went to the bank and said, okay, here's a $100 E-bond, lend me 50. Illegal. Couldn't do it. So that's why you ended up with our national debt. They thought it was cheaper to borrow than to print. It would have been cheaper to print, actually, than to borrow, because then you're constantly paying interest on it, And so that changed when Bretton Woods collapsed. So now the real bulk of the money is not created by the central bank. It's created by Congress because it's all the debt. And look, I mean, is an example of China held 100% of our national debt. Then the $1 trillion we're paying in interest rate would all go to China. All right. So it's more than what just central banks, and not just the Fed. I mean, all of this is basically, it's the debts that have become the real problem because that's the real source of money anymore. It's just, it's currency that pays interest. That's it.
So to your point, I don't know how you unravel that, right? I mean, there's no there's no effective way unless you've got an idea, in which case I'm very open to hearing it. But I've personally thought about it, and I can't figure out a way to unravel it either without just a complete collapse.
I did a video on it. It is on YouTube. It's called The Solution.
Okay.
The only way out of this is I have to look at the government as if I'm bailing out a company. You would do a debt to equity swap with a company. All right. I'll give you equity for the debt. This is what we have to do. But government, you can't give equity in the government. So what are you doing? Basically, you would have to issue coupons to swap for the debt. You take the coupon and you take it down to your broker at Merrill, whatever, and you can buy corporate debt or shares. They then take the coupon and redeem it with the Treasury for that purchase. All right, so we are monetizing it, but we're ending it at the same time. And you either do that or you take Schwab's solution, you default, and you own nothing, Basically,
well, the worry I think we all have is that these people would rather ride it into the ground, right? And then take the Schwab solution, the people that are in power.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem, because it's power. That's what this is all about. And that's why I say, look, the central bank is not the issue. The real problem is the debt. And even beyond that, we have to revise the political system. The Democrats, for example, wouldn't know how to run without promising, vote for me, I'll give you a free car and a lollipop. All right. You have to stop that. And it's vote for me because I'll manage it better than the other guy. It's not what I'm going to give you. You're not bribing everybody. So this is the problem. It's systemic in Canada and Europe. I mean, it's all over. So how do you get out of this unless you have to really reform the political systems as well? That's why I say gold standard fixing. It's not going to happen unless you also have political reform. They have to go hand in hand. You can't do one without the other. And that's the real problem. Our computer also has forecast, and I stood up at our last conference in Orlando, and I said, look, the computer has forecasted that the Democratic Party is going to collapse, and it will split like the Federalists did, pretty much for the same reasons that, the Federalists were a strong, centralized government. We will dictate, and that's it. And you saw it with Camilla. When somebody stood up and said, about God and abortion, she said, you're at the wrong rally. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's my way, not your way. I don't care about what you believe, your religion or whatever. Take it and stuff it. That's not government. That's not democracy, as they pretend we have and we don't. All right. Democracy is where we get to vote. Do we go to war? Yes or no? They take us to war and then they arrest us if we don't show up. Mm-hmm. All right. Vietnam, you were 18. You weren't old enough to have a drink and you weren't old enough to vote, but here's a gun, go kill somebody. That's democracy. You had no right to vote to say, should we go to Vietnam or not? And you can look on.
What do you?
YouTube, John McNamara, Robert McNamara, before he died, admitted he was the neocon that took us into Vietnam. And he put it on there and even wrote a book. We were wrong. Mm-hmm. We thought Russia was involved and it was just a civil war. Well, 58,000 Americans died and how many millions of other people for a civil war that we should never have been in. And I think Ron Paul basically said the same thing, that these neocons have been creating wars for, since the 60s and never won a single one yet. And
Yep.
they're working on Russia now. It's, I've been to dinner with some of them. I know Bill Kristol. He even spoke at one of our conferences back in the 90s. His father started the neocons. I argued with him back in the 90s. He said if we took out Saddam Hussein, Assad out of Syria, and Gaddafi, we'd bring peace to the Middle East. I said, you're out of your mind. It's tribal. We drew those borders. They don't see themselves as all Syrian. You needed somebody like Saddam Hussein because he kept the Sunnis and the Shiites from killing each other, basically. Look, as soon as you took him out, what'd you get? You get ISIS, chopping off people's heads and stuff. These are religious differences that are not solvable. It's like Ireland between the Protestants and the Catholics. The country's just divided, period. You're not going to change that. In London, they still call Catholics papes, and that was from a civil war in 1650. So these things don't die. We've had, 2 employees from Ukraine. One was in Kiev, one was in Donetsk. The 2 would never talk to each other. And if you brought a bottle of Russian vodka to dinner in Kiev, they would have taken and smashed it over the head. I mean, the hatred is systemic there. You're not going to get rid of it. We had a conference in Greece, and the one from Kiev refused to fly home the quickest way because the plane had a changeover in Moscow.
That's some severe adherence to the hatred.
Yeah, look, the only solution should have been the Minsk agreement, like Yugoslavia. All right, Kosovo war, they're all fighting and killing each other. How did it end up? They drew their borders according to their ethnic groups. Look, this goes back centuries. I mean, you look at the hatred between Greece and Turkey. This goes back to Alexander the Great. All right. The English and the French. Most people don't realize, but after World War II, they had to threaten de Gaulle to create the European community. He didn't want to. He finally agreed to take in Germany, but refused to accept English. England wasn't allowed to join the EU until Gaulle died. I mean, look, the resentments are just there for centuries. I mean, that's it. I saw a documentary when FDR went to Boston trying to get us into World War II. And, Boston's mostly Irish. And they said, really? You expect us to go over there and defend Britain after what they did to us? That's why it took Pearl Harbor to get us into World War II. It would not go over. I mean, this is just the way it is. So we have to understand that it's Europe is very much divided still to this day. I'm sure if a French girl were to bring home a German boyfriend, the father's going to say, you do know what they did to us,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know we've gone long. Do you have 5 minutes? Speaking of FDR, talk just 5 minutes about tariffs, what's going on currently with tariffs. Obviously tariffs are a bugaboo word among us libertarians, but I wanted to hear your take on tariffs and people, as you've noted, are blaming tariffs for the upcoming depression in the United States, a recession, whatever you want to call it. But if you have a few more minutes to spend on that, and then I will let you go back to your life.
No, our computer, I stood up in November and have videos on, available. A computer forecasted that, we were going into recession. It's not going to bottom until 2028 before the tariffs. I don't know any economist that has ever blamed the Great Depression on the tariffs. You can't, because Smoot-Hawley took place in June of 1930. when the crash is already going from 29. It was a propaganda rhetoric used by Democrats for the 32 election. That was it. And why? Because Smoot and Hawley were two Republicans. That was basically the whole issue. All right. And the tariffs were on agriculture. They completely omitted, and I would recommend you can get it for free online, Herbert Hoover's memoirs, and read 1931. What they omitted from all the history books was that all of Europe defaulted on its debt. It was a sovereign default, 1931. Even Britain suspended its debt, and Canada as well. So, I mean, that's what took down 9,000 banks, not tariffs. The tariff issue is not, I think it was bad timing for Trump. I understand what his problem is. I know a lot of Canadians actually, off the record, say we should thank Trump because every province acts as if it's its own country. They put tariffs on each other. All right. France is notorious with its tariffs. And then there's another layer where they basically just put in quality controls and block you. They've been talking about how they outlawed nitrogen, fertilizer, and then say, oh, well, no agricultural products from the United States can be imported if they're grown with nitrogen. So this is how they get around stuff like that. The tariffs are not going to cause the recession. China is already in a contracting mode. Germany, the economy has actually shrunk by at least 3%, maybe up to 5%. Because first they put in the COVID lockdowns, then you had the climate change, and then they put in the sanctions on Russia. You just had 2 days were in Spain and Portugal where the power grid went down. All right, trains can't move.
5 days, right, in Spain. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, I live in Florida. When we had the 2 hurricanes, you wouldn't have digital currency. Good luck. A credit card wouldn't even work. All right. If you didn't have cash, you got nothing. All right. So all this, fictional idea of digital currencies, and they're worthless if there's no power. And the same thing with all this, the climate change. I can tell you, and you can Google it up. Who was the first person that proposed it? It was John McCain. And it wasn't for climate. It was basically to cut off the fossil fuel for Russia so he could conquer it. That was it. It had nothing to do with climate. It's been a great propaganda routine. They got a hold of a 16-year-old girl to be the face of it. And that's about it. I mean, the ice caps they've just announced in Antarctica have actually grown. Oh, my God. Look, this is it's all propaganda, and people don't even realize how they've been played. You had a girl actually throw tomato soup on the Mona Lisa. Oh, because it's an oil painting. Sorry, honey, it's not crude oil. This is pretty much it. So, I mean, look, the tariffs are not the real issue. We're going into recession. Europe is probably going into a depression. Their productivity. I'll give you an example. If you look at total consumer spending in the world, U.S. accounts for 25%. What does Europe? $1.20 out of every 10.
Wow.
Europe is, China's number 2 in the world. And Canada is basically they put in Carney and they're just going to commit suicide. That's it. These people do not understand what they're doing. And I don't think they really care. It's all about this global agenda. And Carney was one of the, in there with Schwab. And, he was one of the ones right behind the net zero nonsense. So, and he's going to be this wonderful financial genius for Canada? I don't think so.
I'm with you. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation, Martin. I appreciate you. Hopefully I can reconnect with you at some point in the future, because it's been, as I said, very, very interesting. And because of your background, because of Socrates, because of the way you're connected, you're always interesting to read. Again, I will post all the links to your blog, armstrongeconomics.com. Of course, I'll link to your socials in the show notes for this. And of course, you have the World Economic Conference. Now that, to be clear, is the counterpoint, my friends, to the World Economic Forum. I want to emphasize that, and that Martin is in fact the one you want to be paying attention to.
Yes, Nigel Farage showed up and at our 2019. He says, "Of course I'm here. He's the alternative to Davos."
There you go. The alternative to Davos. I thank you for coming on the Lions of Liberty Network, and also for all of our watchers out there that are watching this to the Libertarian platform. Again, Martin Armstrong, much appreciated, sir. Have a great evening.
Well, you too. Thank you for inviting me.